Okay, we're going to get started with our education panel today. We have here a panel of rock stars in education in Chicago who are just incredible thinkers and doers in practice, in research, in policy, and philanthropy. And I am going to briefly introduce them. You see their bios in your pamphlets, but most of them, all of them, really don't need any introduction, but I will do that anyway and just very briefly set context, and then we're going to, by the end of this hour and 15 minutes or so, we will have a full blueprint for the future of education in the city of Chicago, so I hope somebody is taking notes. So first we have, to my left, we have Tim Knowles, and Tim is the Louis Sebring Director of the Urban Education Institute at the University of Chicago. UEI and Tim are dedicated to building a model that combines charter schools, teacher education, and research in a quest to provide reliable, excellent schooling for children in urban America. And prior to coming to Chicago, Tim served as Deputy Superintendent for Teaching and Learning in the Boston Public Schools. Charles Payne, to my left here, studies and teaches urban education and school reform, school inequality, social change, and modern African American history at the University of Chicago. He is currently on leave as he is spearheading the Woodlawn Children's Promise community, which is I hope we hear a little bit about when we talk today. And to my right here is Gretchen Crosby Sims, who is the Vice President of Programs at the Joyce Foundation. She is pinch hitting today for Ellen Alberding, the President of the Joyce Foundation, who had to leave on a trip earlier than expected. And we also have with us Tim King, who is founder and CEO of Urban Prep Academies. He has 3 campuses currently in Chicago and expanding.
We'll see.
Okay. This is the nation's first all-male charter high school, and with already an impressive track record that he has built up and is one of the exciting leaders of education in Chicago and Hero of the Year, according to People magazine. So you are all my heroes for being here today in the face of what seems to be a cataclysmic storm brewing. So thank you for being here. So just to make sure that this ivory tower gathering, ivory tower setting is firmly grounded in pragmatism and has a sturdy and wide ladder down to the ground, I wanted to provide a bit of context to what some of the near-term considerations will be for the future of education here in Chicago. So once the new mayor appoints a new CEO, presuming he or she would appoint a new CEO, Chicago will have had 4 school superintendents, school CEOs in the last 2 years, plus there'll be a new mayor, plus possible state-level reforms bubbling up from the race to the top work in terms of teacher performance and evaluation systems, and this is the most important point, all in one of the first economic environments in our cities, in the country right now, and really in the city's history as well, in recent history. And the sudden drop in stimulus funds, ARA funds, also doesn't help the situation, since that did help support education positions. So we hope today this panel will look forward, both to the near term and also a little bit to the longer term, to what it means and what it will take to prepare children for the 21st century world. Does the current curriculum, the design of the school year and day, and the ways the district delivers education services even begin to align to what future employers think they will need from CPS graduates? What about preparing children for higher education and the academic rigor of college? How does CPS better align with city colleges to reduce the need for such wide-scale remediation? What can we do to ensure that our most at-risk children arrive better prepared for kindergarten so that they're not spending most of their educational careers playing catch-up? I am a parent of a CPS child, as is Gretchen, and I'm sure my children is shared by every Chicago parent and even every Chicago taxpayer. I want all of our schools, to be interesting, challenging, dynamic, creative places for a child to learn, not only building his literacy and numeracy skills, which will be tested, but also creating citizens for Chicago's democracy, becoming artists, musicians, scientists, and poets. So with that in mind, I am going to start us off by asking each of our panelists to state 2 or 3 actions that he believes the next superintendent of Chicago Public School should take in the near term, and then one longer term thing that will improve education in a profound way in this city. So Tim, why don't we start off with you? And I encourage disagreement. And if you mention early childhood education, I will give you 5 more minutes later.
Cool.
You're talking about that Tim starting, right?
This is going to be very
confusing. Tim Knowles.
Which TK goes first?
Thank you, Cornelia, and thank you for giving me 45 minutes to answer your first question. I'm 2 things. The first is time. Chicago has one of the shortest school days in the country and one of the shortest school years in the country when you compare us to our international countries, both developed and developing. We are woefully far behind. I learned yesterday that when the current school, the architecture of the school's year was established, 85% of Americans were involved in agriculture. Now 3% of Americans are involved in the agriculture business. Arguably, very few of them live in Chicago. This suggests to me that if we're serious about ensuring that children in Chicago are really prepared, they do need a longer school day, they need a longer school week, they need a longer school year, and we have to, even in light of the financial constraints, we have to figure out ways of getting that done if we're serious about remaining as competitive as the mayor suggested this morning we must. The second thing is about people. Teachers and school leaders matter most in this profession. There's unambiguous evidence to that effect. And yet, 50% of urban teachers leave the profession within 5 years. They leave the profession. 80% turnover in half the time is not unusual in really struggling schools. There was a study of all Illinois school districts done in 2005, and this data still holds, these data, of 98,600 teachers in the state of Illinois, how many do you think were removed over an 18-year period per year for underperformance? 2. 2 a year out of 100,000 teachers. So if we're serious about this, and we know people matter so much, what would I do? I would make as transparent as possible the quality of people coming from the various pipelines, the quality of teachers, where they teach in Chicago, how long they teach in Chicago, and whether their students learn, so that Chicago can actually begin to be strategic about the market that it really does control, the teacher market. Second thing I would do is rationalize, and there's lots of energy now around this, the teacher support and supervision process in a very, very intensive way. And the third thing I would do is I would start a, for lack of a better term, a leadership institute for Chicago that would deliver 100 principals a year to the system, from which the system could pick the best 30 or 40 or 50 that it needed.
Great. Charles.
Do you want me to? I'll reinforce some of what Tim said, since for once in his life he got it mostly right. Can't help it.
It's over, Charles. It's
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. School development is very clearly dependent upon principal development, right? It's the leader in the building who has to do this work. Principal development, in my mind, and I've come to appreciate this in a whole different way, watching some of what's happened in Area 15. That's the area of CPS in which I've been most deeply involved in the last year. And they spent virtually a full year working with their principals on virtually nothing except their capacity to evaluate instruction, right? Hear this very clearly. Principals in this system have not traditionally been capable of making reasonable evaluations of instruction. Until we get over that hump, much of the rest of what we do, much of the rest of what we invest is not going to go anyplace, right? So part of principal development is developing the capacity and the sheer confidence and principles that they can make distinctions among the distinctions based on the quality of instruction. That's point one. Point two is related to that. As Tim was implying, every year for I don't know how long, I would guess 30 years to my knowledge, the principals of our city rate the teachers of our city, and they have been telling us for nigh on to 30 years that 90% of the teachers in Chicago are either excellent or superior. If you knew nothing else about the system, that one fact alone would tell you that on the point of instruction, nobody's at home. Nobody's paying any attention. Nobody has the confidence or the willingness to follow through on judging instruction. We should make teacher evaluation serious. It should be attached to data. And when we say that a teacher is superior, there should be some data pertinent to child outcomes that connects to that demonstrates that superiority. The other thing that I would say is, in order to get my extra 5 minutes, right? This may not be fair, but my own sense is that what happened with the emphasis, one of the ways in which Chicago led the nation was this emphasis on test scores, test scores, test scores. My own belief is that had some very, very positive consequences. It also had some negative consequences. One of the negative consequences is that it took the attention of city leadership, and therefore some of the resources in the system away from what was happening in the early years, and it put that attention into what was happening in the tested grades, grades 3 through 12, right? And so that one of the things that means is that I don't think it's any secret that our pre-K classrooms tend to be of very low quality. And there's no secret nationally that pre-K classrooms are easier to improve than classrooms for older children, and we seem to not do that. So far as I can see, the poorest attendance in this city is attendance in the pre-K years, right? One fact, if you wish to know whether a child is going to graduate from high school, and you want to predict that when the child is in second grade, what's the one fact you would want to know to predict when children are in second grade whether they're going to graduate high school? What their attendance is in second grade, right? Second grade attendance predicts 90% of all dropouts in this city, right? So two connected things that I'm stealing a point here, right? On the one hand, we need to have a citywide discussion about reinvesting in the early years, right? And I nominate Dr. Barbara Bowman to lead that discussion because she has nothing else to do. And two, we need as a city to think much, and this I think is a part of a national trend that to my knowledge just began in the last year. Think in a much more serious way about who is going to school, the attendance issue. The city has not had coherent attendance policies, to my knowledge, since 1995 or 1996 when we got rid of truant officers, right? It's relatively low-hanging fruit, so.
Okay, thank you. Gretchen, I think I failed to mention that Gretchen used to be the education program officer at the Joyce Foundation, which is how I met her many years ago, and she's incredibly smart about education, so.
Well, Cornelia said that she wanted us to disagree, but I don't think I can. Unfortunately, you're going to see a lot of consistency, but I think it's important to see where the consistency is. First of all, I would say that I think that the next mayor and the next schools chief do have incredibly large shoes to fill on the issue of education reform, both in terms of the breadth of experimentation that's been tried over the last number of years and some of the very promising results, incremental but promising. The number one factor, as Tim said, in whether or not a student learns is the quality of their teacher. And so much research has come out on this lately that it is unavoidable that has to be the number one priority of the next mayor and the next schools chief. And as both my colleagues have mentioned, one of the biggest problems is that we have haphazard recruiting systems. Most countries that are at the top of the international achievement are recruiting from the top quartiles of their university graduates. We're recruiting from the bottom. We recruit really late in the city of Chicago. We're hiring after a lot of the best teachers have been already picked off by neighboring school systems. We have been providing uneven support to teachers in their first couple of years, which is the hardest time to sort of, is the time of greatest need. But most importantly, we have been absolutely lousy at how we evaluate teachers. We don't have a clue right now which teachers are effective at promoting student growth and which teachers really need some support. We've had a checklist for years that principals use that has 27 different things on it, like, is their classroom neat? Do they teach violence prevention occasionally? And it's ridiculous. Is there evidence that their kids are learning is not one of the factors. Now, to its credit, the state has passed some legislation that requires school districts to do this, and Chicago is moving in that direction. But I would say that it is the #1 priority of the next schools chief to make that reform of teacher evaluation system a priority and to root it in a significant way in evidence of student learning. The second thing I'd say, and this is both as someone who follows education reform debates and as a parent, as Cornelia said, of 2 kids who are in Chicago public school systems, the length of our school year in the state and the length of our school day is incredibly short. Elementary school kids go to school on average 5 hours and 45 minutes a day, and in cities like Dallas and Indianapolis and Baltimore and Pittsburgh, they're going 6.5, 7 hours a day. Kids in our state go maybe 180 days a year, but there are a lot of waivers, so I think actually your husband has done a piece on how it ends up being 172 or 173 days a year. By the time our kids graduate from high school, they will have had 3 years less of instruction than kids in Houston. I don't know how we're going to have results that are going to be anywhere near kids around the country, let alone the world, if we're shortchanging them that much. And it is an incredibly contentious issue, particularly given the budget situation that we're in right now. We've got a $700 million budget deficit, and at the same time, we also have some of the highest teacher salaries in the country. And so we are paying top dollar for teacher salaries. And I think it's fair to ask why our kids aren't getting top instructional time. So I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's a fair question for the next mayor and CEO to consider. 2 other quick things. I'm expecting that Tim may do a shout out for charters. The Joyce Foundation is a strong supporter of high quality charters, recognizing that we need to shut down low quality charters, but we need to expand the number of high quality charters. The other thing that I would just say that should be a priority for the next mayor and schools chief is reform of the city colleges, the community college system here in Chicago. It is one of the largest in the country. 120,000 kids and students get served, but and it's one of the most important sort of training grounds for our local employers, and also engines for students who want to transfer to four-year institutions. But the completion rates there are dismal, and I'm sure you're going to hear about that later this afternoon. The new Chancellor, Cheryl Hyman, is putting together a fantastic reform plan, and the next mayor and CEO should be fully supportive of that.
Tim King, you are in the unenviable position of going last.
Right,
You
and
cannot
everybody
agree.
said everything I wanted to say already. So the question was, what do we think the new mayor should do immediately to positively impact education? So the first thing I would say, and I don't mean this in a trite way, is hire a CEO. Cornelia kind of said, we're assuming that the new mayor will hire a CEO, and I think that's a good assumption, but I think it's important that the new mayor do that as quickly as possible. It sends a very significant signal to our city and to the country when you get elected as mayor and one of your first actions is to put the spotlight on education by hiring a new leader, whether you call that person a CEO or a superintendent or schools chief, whatever. There needs to be someone hired at the helm. It is incredibly challenging for any school district or for any school within that district to operate well when there's a state of flux. The folks that we've had leading the schools in the city of Chicago have all been great people, highly committed, really interested in pushing school reform, but we've had 4, there will have been 4 by the time a new one gets appointed. If you drill down within CPS and take into consideration all of the changes and turnover that have taken place due to the economy and the shifts in leadership, that further impacts the ability for schools at the ground level to be able to operate effectively. As the operator of 3 charter schools, we've seen multiple leaders in the Office of New Schools over the course of the last several years. That office has grown to as many as 30 people and shrunk to as few as, I don't know how many are in there now, 10 or so. And that really poses a challenge for school operators. So I hope that the new mayor makes it a priority to hire a new CEO who can really, really be a leader and can drive for, hopefully as long as Arnie did, for a long period of time, the direction of the city. I would also say that, again, talking about what the mayor can do as opposed to what a CEO can do, because I, of course, agree completely that the school year and school day need to be lengthened. I really do think that's more of a job of the CEO or head of the schools as opposed to the mayor. But I think the mayor can put the full weight of his or her office behind funding reform, because I think that's another thing that is really, really a key element if we're going to properly pay attention to education. We have to figure out how to make funding of schools much more equitable. I think the mayor can do a lot to push us in the right direction there. And, you know, finally, I would add two more things. One, you're absolutely right. I think charter schools can be great, and I think that the new mayor should push for additional charter schools and new school development, and should continue to push for closing of failing schools. We have to figure out how to define failing schools, but I do think we shouldn't be afraid of closing failing schools, whether they be charter or traditional schools, and we should be in favor of opening new schools that are going to be high performing. The last thing I would mention, and I think this is more a CEO change as opposed to a mayoral one, I think we've got to, as Charles has indicated, we've got to get this evaluation of students right. I think that right now, the way we evaluate students and the way we evaluate schools is not based on growth, but really based on, you know, I run high schools. So people will look at 11th grade scores for the PSAE or the ACT, and they will compare those to the following year. Well, that doesn't really tell us how well the students have done, because you're comparing two different cohorts of students. We really need to figure out how to look at a student or a group of students from day one in Chicago Public Schools all the way to the day they leave, and see what the growth has been and evaluate the students and the schools in that way, as opposed to, I think, our emphasis now on, you know, from year to year, which doesn't really take into account how the students have or have not achieved.
Tim, could I ask you just to say a little bit more about what you mean by education funding reform?
Sure.
For
So
charters or for?
yeah, well, for everyone, but you know, I have a particular love for charters, so I think that's an issue that needs to be addressed. But I think everyone in this room knows that property taxes are the way that Chicago public schools are funded, and so what you end up with is a system where you've got schools in rich communities, suburban communities in the state of Illinois that are able to spend much more money on public education than schools within the city. We know that the state has a mandate actually to be the primarily responsible for funding schools. That isn't how it's been happening. The Chicago Urban League right now, as a matter of fact, has a lawsuit in the works that hopefully will move that in the right direction so that we can get more equitable funding across the state. I don't think a child's education should be based on what neighborhood or what city or what school district they happen to be in, at least the funding of that education. So that's what I mean when I say funding equity and funding reform. On the charter school thing, since you brought it up, charter schools right now in the city of Chicago, depending upon who you listen to, probably get about 75% of the per pupil that a traditional public school in the city will get, which is why charter schools have to do so much aggressive fundraising, which I don't think is a bad thing, because that's bringing private money into public education, you know, which is good, but there needs to be greater equity there as well. We are educating public school children. We are a public school. We should be getting the same amount of money as any public school receives.
Could I just make a counterpoint? Clearly, the equity arguments are real. You compare Winnetka to Chicago or whatever, and it's stunning, and you've got the kids who need the most getting the least. However, there's also, looking at the national kind of picture of this, there's over the last 20, 30 years, and some of you may have seen these slides, you look at the education investment that our country is making, and there's a very, very steep graph upwards. And you look at the NAEP scores, which is the nation's best assessment that looks at kids across the country, and they're flat. And so there's dissonance there, and I think in addition, particularly in this financial climate, to the mayor arguing for making the equity argument, we also have to look really hard at how we're spending the money we've got. And if we don't, we're not going to be able to make a pitch for more money. Districts, by and large, still have embedded in them a huge amount of money that doesn't make it to the threshold of the schoolhouse. It just doesn't get there.
Right.
And if we're not willing to look hard at that, whatever the percentage may be in a given year, and make strategic investments in kids, in extending time with the money that we've got, I think we're going to have a very hard time making the
Yeah,
sort of
I agree with that.
political
I think there's a difference between equity and increasing. And I'm talking about equity.
Right.
And, you know,
I
I
understand.
think there needs to be fairness.
Right.
You know, now we can continue the conversation around what that amount should be. But my argument is it should be the same amount.
Right.
And there should be equity and fairness, you know, for a kid in Inglewood, just as there, you know, just for, like there may be for a student who lives in Winnetka.
Go ahead, Charles.
I just want to say that I very much agree with Tim's point, but that example about the NAEP scores and the funding, I'm sorry, Tim Knowles. Although I agree with both Tims, of course.
You should say good-looking Tim.
I'm not
talking
touching
about me.
I won't touch that. My understanding of what is happening with the NAEP scores is that if you look at scores in aggregate, they have not changed. If you disassemble the scores by income level, the performance of the students coming from the bottom third of the income distribution is substantially stronger today than it was when we had the first NAEP scores. The aggregate score, you lose that very important fact. That said, the point he was trying to make is absolutely true. Too much of what we spend does not get to the teacher and the child in a way that's going to make a difference. That example can be a little misleading.
Tim Knowles, can I ask you, are there areas in school budgets that you think are obvious, pots of money that are being misspent now that could be reprioritized?
just let
Since
me
you
add
brought
it.
it up.
Let me add it. No,
Are you gunning to be the next
No, I'm
school
not.
CEO?
No, by no means. I mean, districts are spending, in some cases, up to a third of the dollars they have available on the district architecture itself. So we, as charter schools, get the Chicago. If you take the aggregate number of dollars and you divide it by the number of children, you get about $10,000 or $11,000 per child. For a charter elementary school, when we look at public sources, we're getting about $6,000 per child. So there's a big gap there, right? And that's not to suggest we don't need roofs and boilers and other things, but there's a very, very big gap between the aggregate and what the schools receive at the end of the day, and that's playing out across urban areas nationally. This gap. But then in the schoolhouse, if you think about the schoolhouse and thinking about, okay, with those dollars, whatever those dollars that you have, what are you doing with them? One very small example from our work was to say, what is this thing called an assistant principal? It is a thing that does discipline, that does buses, does other things, cafeteria duty. Could we do that differently? And what we now have is a position called Director of Family and Community Engagement, which is really a position that is enlisting the assets of the family and the community in the schoolhouse every day. So we're spending the money still, yes, but we're spending it in fundamentally different ways. And I think that's sort of emblematic of the kind of work that we have to do if we're serious about getting to a different place.
I would add one thing. Probably the biggest driver of school budgets are labor costs, teacher salaries, principal salaries. And one of the things that we do now that's totally irrational, if you look at the research, is we pay teachers more for having master's degrees. And in Illinois, I think teachers with master's degrees get something like 43% more than, there's a 43% premium, if I have these numbers right, but I want to check them. I just read it last night late. And whereas other states like Oregon, for example, I think have just a 3% premium for that. Now, you sort of say, okay, I've got a science, a science teacher with an advanced science degree. There are a couple of degrees, advanced science degrees and advanced math degrees, maybe the only ones, where having an advanced degree translates into bigger gains, learning gains for the students of that teacher. But by and large, teachers who have master's degrees are no more effective than teachers who don't have master's degrees. It would be smarter for us to take the millions and millions of dollars that we spend on master's degrees and put it into perhaps pay increases for teachers that are really effective, who we want to make sure we keep in the classroom. That's a radical statement. It shouldn't be, but it's a radical statement. And figuring out how to undo that current budget allocation architecture is going to be politically incredibly difficult. Chicago has tried to do it in some pilot ways by adding on bonuses on top of the current salaries for teachers, but hasn't meddled with trying to undo the current system.
So Gretchen, one of the things, just to say in a different way, what we've done is we've conflated years of service and credits accumulated with teacher quality, right? So you get more money based on how many years you have in, and you get more money based on how many degrees or credits you've accumulated, and that's it. That's the game, and you're right, there are hundreds of millions of dollars if you look at a state level, and probably hundreds in Chicago, which are all bound up in that.
But that all goes back to creating the right way to evaluate teachers and figure out, how we determine whether or not a teacher is effective, which is in and of itself, as
That
we
needs to
know,
come first.